Well, good afternoon. Happy Friday, February 16th. Mark Milam here, your mortgage professional. Let's get right to the week that was not my favorite week in terms of mortgage interest rates, not my favorite week for housing affordability. Why did rates worsen this week? Well, a lot of the noise is around inflation. And when we talk about inflation, we're always talking about three particular reports. There's the Consumer Price Index, the Producer Price Index, and then the Fed's favorite measure of inflation, Personal Consumption Expenditures, PCE. We get PCE on February the 29th. That's the next big date to watch as it pertains to what's happening with inflation, and what happens with inflation is certainly going to be a driver for what happens with interest rates and affordability. But this week, all eyes were on CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, and it came in a little hot compared to expectations. Now, when I say a little hot, it really wasn't that big of a beat. Came in about 0.1 to 0.2% hotter than consensus estimates, which isn't really that much. But boy, the market had heavily weighted that we thought that the Consumer Price Index was going to come in at or below expectations. And that unwelcome news sent the 10-year up, it sent mortgage rates up, and has worsened affordability as the week has worn on. Let me show you a little bit of what I'm talking about. This is a live look at mortgage-backed securities, and I'll go back to the week that was. This is the date right here, February 13th, day before Valentine's Day, that we got the Consumer Price Index numbers, and you can see a precipitous sell-off in mortgage-backed securities, resulting in higher interest rates along the lines of at least an eighth to a quarter point, maybe even some instances 3/8 of a point higher in interest rates, so a big loss in one day. And you can see on the 14th and the 15th, we got a lot of that back, and yet we're giving whatever we got back again today. Not a very good day today, thanks to the Producer Price Index, which also came in hot. So when we start talking about these indices and we start talking about inflation, it's really important, and the devil's kind of in the details here, but it's really important to understand how the Bureau of Labor Statistics gets inflation data. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here. I'll flip the screen back around and show you. This is the table of all of the measures of inflation that fold up under the Consumer Price Index. And there's one down here I want to draw your attention to because it's the most important one, and it's shelter, right? And when we talk about shelter as a function of inflation, we're talking about housing here, or housing or shelter. It's the single largest piece of the pie that determines what our inflation number is, especially within the Consumer Price Index. It's 42% of the pie is shelter. But when you start talking about housing or shelter as it relates to inflation, we're not talking about buying and selling homes. We're not talking about any of that, because that's really an investment. It's not an expense, according to the government. So we're really talking about rent. Rent is what makes up the shelter component, the largest component of our inflation reading, and the big driver of what's happening with interest rates. It's all around rents. And there's two ways that we measure rents. And that when we talk about that 42% piece of the pie, there's two components that go into it. There's rent of primary residence, which is literally just taking a survey of what you're paying for rent if you're renting there. And then the other one is the really, really interesting and controversial one, and that is what we call owner's equivalent rent, or OER, owner's equivalent rent, which is a much higher percentage of that shelter component than the first one I just told you about. So let me talk to you a little bit about what we're looking at here and why it's so fascinating. Owner's equivalent of rent is where the Bureau of Labor Statistics picks up the phone and they call a certain number of homeowners across different geographic regions in the United States. And this number varies, but it's usually around 40,000 people out of a country of 300 million people. And they say, if you were to rent your home, what do you think that it would rent for unfurnished? That's the question. And then the owner says whatever they think it would rent for, and that's how they get the data for this survey. If your mind is blown by how our country derives its information for the most important component of the CPI number, mine is too. That is an unbelievable way for us to aggregate data for something that affects so many people, this Consumer Price Index. But I promise you, I am not making it up. So the owner's equivalent of rent, here's the question that gets asked. If someone were to rent your home today, how much do you think it would rent for monthly, unfurnished, and without utilities? And then the answer comes in, and it goes into this owner's equivalent of rent figure. Here's where things get particularly interesting. This is a chart of the rent of primary residence and the owner's equivalent rent. And I'm comparing these two over time, and I'm going all the way back to January of 2019 here. The blue line is the rent of primary residence, and the amber line or the brown line is the owner's equivalent rent. You can see they kind of move in concert with one another, and you would expect that over time. They kind of move in the same general direction, and on we move until this report, and this happened right here. We saw rent of primary residence come down, meaning rents are coming down and inflation is coming down. We're starting to see deflationary trends with rent of primary residence, which is consistent ever since we go back here to the mid-2022. But owner's equivalent of rent did what? Went way up. Owner's equivalent of rent diverged significantly from rent of primary residence, and that owner's equivalent of rent, because it's such a heavily weighted piece of our consumer price index, is what wound up forcing us to beat consensus estimates on the CPI. Matter of fact, if you go over here and take a look, this is one of the people that I follow on Twitter. They're talking about how owner's equivalent of rent, this greenish line here, deviated from every other metric that we use to pay attention to rents. And they're basically saying, listen, one report does not a trend make. Right now, this is noise. It is not a signal. This is not a trend. This is an aberration more than anything. But unfortunately, that aberration caused the CPI to come in hot. And the way that our country inexplicably measures inflation by calling a certain number of homeowners and asking them what they think their home would rent for leads to this kind of bad intelligence, this kind of bad information, pushes the CPI too high, worsens mortgage interest rates, impacts affordability for home buyers, and we're just left. We're kind of the tail of the dog in this inflation data anomaly. So ultimately now, what we turn our sights to February the 29th, personal consumption expenditures. It's the Fed's favorite measure of inflation. If we can get a nice number there coming in at or below expectations, we can reverse some of this negative trend that we've experienced this week and hope for better days ahead. We're going to hang our hats on that as we move into the holiday weekend. If I can be of any service to you, don't hesitate to reach out. Mark.Milam at highlandmtg.com. Have a good day.